I went to the county records office on a quiet Tuesday morning, expecting nothing more than a routine update, but the clerk looked at her screen, frowned slightly and said, "Ma'am, it shows here you transferred your lake property 2 years ago." And in that moment, something inside me went completely still because I had never transferred anything to anyone. I remember the fluorescent lights above us humming softly, the kind of sound you don't notice until everything else feels wrong. And I remember the way my hands rested on the counter, perfectly still, as if they belonged to someone else. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me, because I had always prided myself on being organized, careful, the kind of woman who kept every document in labeled folders and every receipt in neat envelopes, especially after my husband, Thomas, passed away 5 years ago and left me to manage everything on my own. The clerk gave me a polite, practiced smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and turned her screen slightly toward me, pointing at a line of text filled with numbers and dates that didn't match anything I remembered. My name was there, clear as day, followed by a signature that looked enough like mine to make my chest tighten. But something about it felt off, like looking at your reflection and realizing it's just slightly out of sync. "Is there a copy of the document?" I asked, and she nodded, printing it out with a soft mechanical whir that seemed too loud in the quiet room. I took the paper in my hands and for a second I simply stared at it, not reading, just feeling the weight of it, because papers like this aren't just ink and signatures, they're pieces of your life, decisions you remember making, moments you can place in time, and this one had no memory attached to it at all. I thanked her, folded the document carefully, and slipped it into my purse without another word, because I have learned over the years that reacting too quickly rarely leads to clarity, and besides, confusion is a private thing, something you carry quietly until it starts to make sense. Outside, the air was cool for early spring, and I stood there for a moment beside my car, watching people come and go as if the world hadn't just shifted slightly under my feet. I tried to tell myself there had to be a simple explanation, a clerical error, maybe something Thomas had arranged before he passed and I had forgotten, though that didn't feel right either because Thomas had always made sure I understood everything, every account, every property, every detail, as if he knew one day I would need to stand on my own. I drove home slowly, my mind replaying the clerk's words over and over again, each time sounding less like a mistake and more like a question I didn't yet know how to answer. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed how quiet the house felt, the kind of quiet that presses in on you. And I sat in the car a little longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the steering wheel as I tried to piece together something that made sense. The lake house, it wasn't just any property, it was the place Thomas and I had spent summers, where Daniel used to run barefoot along the dock, laughing in that carefree way children do before life teaches them to be careful with their words and their silences. Daniel. The thought of my son came gently at first, almost like a reflex, because he had always been part of every important decision, especially after his father passed, stepping in to help with things I didn't fully understand at the time, bringing along his wife, Emily, who always seemed so composed, so capable, offering to handle the paperwork whenever something complicated came up. I had been grateful for that back then. Grateful enough not to ask too many questions. I finally stepped out of the car and walked inside, the familiar scent of my home grounding me in a way the outside world suddenly couldn't. I went straight to the study where I kept my files, opening drawers with steady hands, pulling out folders labeled in my own handwriting, flipping through pages that told the story I knew by heart. Deeds, tax records, insurance documents, everything was there, everything in its place, except for anything that matched the paper now sitting in my purse. I sat down slowly, placing both hands flat on the desk, and allowed myself one quiet breath, just one, before the realization settled in, not as panic, not even as fear, but as something colder, more precise. If I didn't remember making that decision, and if the record said I did, then either my memory had failed me in a way it never had before, or someone had made that decision for me. And as that thought took shape, clear and undeniable, another followed close behind, softer but far more unsettling, because there were only a few people who had ever had access to those papers, only a few people I had trusted enough to let them see every detail of my life, and for the first time I found myself wondering not what had gone wrong, but who had been standing quietly in the background while it did. I did not open my purse right away. Instead, I sat there in my study, surrounded by the quiet order I had spent years building, and let the silence settle into something I could listen to. There is a difference between confusion and realization, and I have learned over time that rushing to close that gap only leads to more questions. So I stayed still, my eyes resting on the familiar labels of my folders, each one written in my own careful script, each one representing a piece of a life I had managed on my own since Thomas passed. It had not been easy. There were months when I counted every dollar, when I stood in the grocery aisle deciding what I could put back, when I delayed refilling prescriptions because something else felt more urgent. But I never complained. Daniel had his own life, his own responsibilities, and I told myself that this was what independence looked like at my age. He called when he could. He visited when it was convenient. And when he did come by, Emily was often with him, always composed, always attentive in that quiet way that made you feel taken care of without quite knowing why. She would bring folders sometimes or mention paperwork that needed to be updated, her voice steady, her tone reassuring, as if she had already thought 3 steps ahead of whatever problem I might be facing. I had trusted that. I realize now how easily trust can look like convenience when you are tired. I reached for my purse then, slowly, as if the movement itself might disturb something fragile in the air, and took out the document the clerk had given me. This time I read it carefully, line by line, date by date. The transfer had been processed 2 years ago, in late April, a time I could almost place if I tried hard enough. That was around the time I had been dealing with the roof repairs after that heavy spring storm. I remember Emily offering to help coordinate things, saying she knew a contractor, that she could handle the calls so I would not have to worry. It had felt like a relief back then, a small kindness in a season that already felt overwhelming. I turned the page, studying the signature again, tracing the curve of the letters with my eyes. It was close enough to mine that anyone glancing at it would not question it, but I could see the difference now, the slight hesitation where my hand would have been more fluid, the way the final letter did not quite match the rhythm I had used for decades. I set the paper down and opened one of my older folders, pulling out a document I knew I had signed myself. I placed them side by side, not with urgency, not with panic, but with the quiet patience of someone who understands that truth does not need to be forced. It reveals itself when you give it space. The difference was there. Small, almost invisible, but undeniable once you saw it. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, not sharp, not trembling, just steady, because whatever this was, it had not happened by accident. Documents do not change themselves. Signatures do not appear on their own. And yet, for 2 years, I had lived my life believing everything was exactly as it should be, while something fundamental had already been taken out from under me. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to remember. April. Roof repairs. Emily's voice in my kitchen, calm and efficient, explaining what needed to be done. Daniel nodding along, distracted, checking his phone between sentences. I remember signing something that week, though I had not thought much of it at the time. There had been several forms, estimates, insurance papers, things that blurred together when you were trying to keep up. I remember Emily sliding a page toward me, pointing to where I needed to sign, saying, "This one just authorizes the contractor to move forward." I had not questioned it. Why would I? She had always been so careful, so organized. And I had been grateful. Grateful enough not to read every line as closely as I normally would have. My eyes opened slowly, returning to the present, to the paper in front of me that now seemed to carry more weight than it should. If that moment, that single decision, had been something else entirely, then the question was not just how this happened, but how long it had been happening without me noticing. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where nothing seemed out of place, where neighbors went about their day unaware that anything had shifted. It struck me then, not as fear but as clarity, that whatever had been done carefully, deliberately, in a way that relied on my trust more than anything else. And trust, once given, does not ask for proof. It assumes it is safe. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, and allowed one final thought to settle into place, simple and precise, because there are moments in life when everything becomes clear, not all at once, but in quiet pieces that fit together without effort. If someone had needed my signature and I had not given it, then they must have taken it. And if they had taken it once, then there was no reason to believe they had stopped there. I did not call Daniel that afternoon. That was the first decision I made, and it came easier than I expected. In the past, any confusion, any small uncertainty, I would have reached for the phone without thinking, trusting that my son would help me make sense of things the way he used to when he was younger, when he still looked at me as if I had all the answers and he only needed a little guidance. But something about this felt different. This was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a quick conversation. This was something that had been put in place quietly, carefully, and conversations have a way of warning people before you are ready to see how they react when they do not feel prepared. So instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Emily had once spread out paperwork in neat, organized stacks, pointing to lines, explaining things in a tone that made everything sound simple, manageable, already handled. I could still see her there in my mind, her posture straight, her movements precise, the way she would smile slightly when I signed something, as if we had just completed a task together. At the time, it had felt like partnership. Now, sitting alone in that same space, it felt like something else entirely, something I had not been meant to notice. I took a slow sip of tea and let my thoughts move carefully, not jumping ahead, not assuming more than I knew. There had been forms. That much I remembered. There had been several occasions when Emily offered to take care of things, especially after Thomas passed, when the weight of managing everything alone still felt new and unfamiliar. She had always framed it as helping, as making things easier for me, and I had accepted that help without hesitation because it came from family, from someone who had married into our lives and seemed eager to be part of it. But now, as I began to revisit those moments one by one, I noticed something I had missed before. The way she would gather documents before I had a chance to read them fully. The way she would summarize instead of letting me take my time. The way Daniel would sit nearby, present but not engaged, nodding occasionally, as if everything being said had already been agreed upon somewhere else. I set the cup down gently and stood, walking back to my study with a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from intention. If something had been changed, if something had been taken, then there would be more than one trace. There are always patterns, even in things designed to remain hidden. I opened another drawer and began pulling out additional records, not just the ones related to the lake house, but everything that had passed through my hands in the last few years. Bank statements, insurance, policies, property tax notices. I laid them out across the desk, creating my own quiet map of the life I thought I had been living. At first, everything seemed as it should be. Numbers aligning, dates making sense, the familiar rhythm of bills paid and accounts maintained. But then slowly I started to notice small inconsistencies. A payment listed under a different account number. A mailing address that did not quite match the one I had always used. A letter confirming a change I did not remember requesting. None of these things on their own would have raised alarm. They were too small, too easy to overlook, the kind of details you assume you simply forgot about. But together they formed something else, something that felt less like coincidence and more like design. I paused, resting my hands on the edge of the desk, and allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been avoiding since the moment the clerk spoke that morning. This was not one mistake. This was a series of decisions made without me, or worse, made to look as if they had been mine. And the only people who had ever been close enough, trusted enough, to move through my records without question were the same two people who now felt just slightly out of reach whenever I tried to look at them directly. Daniel with his distracted kindness, his easy reassurances. Emily with her careful efficiency, her quiet control over every situation she stepped into. I did not feel anger, not yet. What I felt was something colder, something clearer. I felt awareness. The kind that does not rush forward, does not accuse but simply observes and waits. I gathered the documents back into a single stack, aligning the edges with precise movements, because control, even in small things, matters when larger things begin to shift. Then I picked up my phone not to call but to check the date. Sunday. They usually came by on Sundays. Dinner, conversation, the familiar rhythm of family maintaining itself on the surface while something else moved quietly underneath. I placed the phone back down and allowed a small, almost imperceptible thought to take shape, not fully formed, not yet a plan but something close to it. If there were answers to be found, they would not come from asking directly. They would come from watching, listening, letting people speak when they believed there was nothing left to hide. And for the first time in a very long time, I found myself not preparing to be reassured, but preparing to understand exactly who I had been trusting all along. Sunday arrived the way it always did, quietly and without announcement, the sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor as if nothing had changed, as if the rhythm of my life had not already been disrupted in ways that could not be undone, And I moved through the morning with the same care I always had, preparing dinner, setting the table, placing each plate and utensil exactly where it belonged, because there is a certain comfort in routine when everything else begins to feel uncertain. And by the time I heard the sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway, I had already decided that nothing about this evening would appear different. Not yet. I opened the door before they knocked, offering the same small smile I had given them for years, the kind that did not ask questions and did not reveal answers, and Daniel stepped inside first, leaning down to kiss my cheek in that familiar, distracted way, his mind already somewhere else, while Emily followed just behind him, her expression composed, her eyes scanning the room for a brief moment in a way that might have seemed casual to anyone else but now felt deliberate, as if she were taking inventory of something only she understood. "It smells wonderful," she said, setting her purse neatly on the chair as she always did. Her voice warm, practiced, controlled, and I nodded, thanking her, turning back toward the kitchen without lingering because I wanted to watch without being watched. Dinner unfolded the way it always had, with polite conversation filling the spaces where something deeper used to exist, Daniel talking about work, about deadlines and meetings, his words flowing easily but never quite landing anywhere meaningful, while Emily added details at just the right moments, reinforcing his stories, shaping them in subtle ways that made it difficult to tell where his voice ended and hers began, and I listened, not interrupting, not guiding the conversation as I once might have, but simply allowing it to move around me while I observed the spaces between their words. There is a certain kind of silence that exists even in conversation, a silence that reveals more than anything spoken out loud, and I began to notice it in the way Daniel avoided looking directly at me when I asked simple questions, in the way Emily answered before he had the chance, her tone light but her timing precise, as if she had already anticipated what I might say before I said it. I waited until we were halfway through the meal before I introduced the smallest shift, nothing dramatic, nothing that could be seen as confrontation, just a question placed carefully where it would seem natural. "I was at the county office this week," I said, keeping my voice even as I set my fork down, giving the impression of casual conversation rather than intention, and Daniel nodded absently, murmuring something about paperwork always being a hassle, but Emily's reaction was different, not obvious, not enough for anyone who was not looking closely, but I was looking closely now, and I saw the brief pause in her movement, the way her hand stilled for just a fraction of a second before she continued, her expression unchanged. "I had to update a few records," I continued, allowing a small space between my words, not rushing, not pressing, and this time Daniel glanced up, his attention shifting slightly, though his expression remained neutral, while Emily reached for her glass, taking a slow sip as if giving herself a moment to measure her response. "Everything goes smoothly?" she asked, her tone light, almost too light, and I nodded once, letting my gaze rest on her just long enough to make the moment settle. "Not exactly," I said, and then I stopped, allowing the silence to stretch, because silence has a way of drawing out what people are trying to hold back, and in that quiet space I saw it again, the smallest exchange between them, not even a look, just a shift in awareness, as if something unspoken had passed between them without needing words. Daniel cleared his throat, adjusting slightly in his chair, and I realized then that whatever had been done had not been done entirely in the dark, that there were layers to this, pieces that fit together in ways I was only beginning to understand. "What kind of issue?" he asked, his voice careful now, measured in a way that did not match the casual tone he had used earlier, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath before answering, because this was not the moment to reveal everything, only enough to see how they would respond. "Just a discrepancy," I said, folding my hands lightly in front of me, maintaining the same calm I had carried since that morning. "Something about a property transfer I do not remember making." The words settled over the table like a quiet weight, not heavy enough to break anything, but enough to make everything shift slightly out of place, and this time, neither of them spoke immediately. Emily was the first to recover, offering a soft, reassuring smile that might have worked before, might have eased my concerns without question, but now felt like something rehearsed, something placed carefully where it was expected. "Oh, those records can be confusing," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Sometimes things get filed incorrectly or processed under the wrong account. It happens more than you would think." I watched her as she spoke, noting the steadiness of her tone, the absence of hesitation, and I realized that whatever explanation she was offering had already been prepared long before this conversation ever began. Daniel nodded quickly, agreeing with her, his relief almost visible in the way he leaned back slightly, as if her words had given him something to hold on to, and I let the moment pass without challenge, without correction, because the truth does not need to be forced into the open. It reveals itself when people believe they have already explained it away. I picked up my fork again, continuing the meal as if nothing had changed, as if the question I had asked had not shifted the air between us, but inside, something had settled into place with quiet certainty. They were not surprised. Not really. And that told me more than any answer they could have given. I did not challenge her explanation, not because I believed it, but because I understood something important in that moment that I had not fully accepted before, that the truth I was looking for would not come from what they chose to tell me, but from what they assumed I would accept without question, and so I nodded once, as if her answer had settled everything, and returned my attention to my plate, letting the conversation drift back to safer topics, work updates, small complaints about traffic, things that filled space without revealing anything real. After dinner, Emily offered to help clear the table, just as she always did, her movements efficient, practiced, and I watched her from the corner of my eye as she gathered the dishes, noting how comfortable she was in my kitchen, how easily she moved through it as if it were her own, and I realized then that familiarity can sometimes be mistaken for belonging, and I wondered how long that line had been blurred without me noticing. Daniel stepped outside to take a call, leaving the two of us alone for a moment, and the quiet that followed felt different from before, not heavy, not tense, but precise, like a pause waiting to be filled with something meaningful. Emily rinsed a plate, setting it carefully in the drying rack before turning to me with that same composed expression, the same steady calm that had once reassured me. "You should not worry too much about those records," she said gently, not looking directly at me at first, her tone almost soothing. "Things like that can get complicated, especially with older accounts." I dried my hands slowly on a towel, taking my time before responding, because timing matters more than words in moments like this. "I have always managed my accounts carefully," I said, my voice even, not defensive, not accusatory, just factual, and she smiled slightly, as if acknowledging that point without truly engaging with it. "Of course," she replied, "and you have done a wonderful job, but sometimes it helps to have someone double-check things, just to make sure everything stays organized." There it was again, that quiet positioning, that subtle shift of control presented as assistance, and I felt something inside me settle further, not anger, not yet, but certainty, the kind that removes doubt piece by piece until there is nothing left to question. Daniel returned a few minutes later, his presence filling the room with a kind of easy distraction, and the moment passed without being acknowledged, as if it had never existed, but I carried it with me, storing it carefully alongside everything else I had begun to notice. When they left that evening, I stood at the door as I always did, watching their car pull away, their figures framed by the soft glow of the porch light, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to see them not as I had always seen them, but as they were now, two people moving in quiet alignment, sharing something unspoken, something that did not include me. I closed the door gently and turned the lock, the soft click echoing in the stillness of the house, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel alone in a way that was empty, but alone in a way that was clear, as if the absence of noise had finally made space for understanding. I walked back to my study, the documents still spread across the desk where I had left them, and sat down with a sense of purpose that felt different from before, more focused, more deliberate. If they believed I would accept simple explanations, then they believed I would not look deeper, and that assumption more than anything else gave me the advantage I needed. I reached for my phone and began searching for the contact information of the county records office again, not to question what I had already been told, but to request copies, full records, every document related to my name over the past several years, because partial information leaves room for interpretation, and I was no longer interested in interpretations. I wanted facts. I wanted timelines. I wanted to see, in clear sequence, exactly when things had changed and how often it had happened. The woman on the phone was polite, efficient, explaining the process in a measured tone, and I listened carefully, writing down each step, each requirement, not rushing, not skipping ahead, because this was no longer about a single document or a single mistake. This was about understanding the full scope of something that had been done quietly, patiently, over time. When I hung up, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a single steady breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something solid, something I could stand on. There was a difference now, one I could not ignore. Before, I had been reacting, trying to make sense of something unexpected. Now I was preparing. And preparation, I have learned, is what separates those who are caught off guard from those who are ready when the truth finally reveals itself. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, aligning them carefully, and placed them in front of me as if they were the beginning of something rather than the end. Because whatever had been taken, whatever had been changed, had been done with the expectation that I would never notice, that I would continue living my life exactly as I had before, trusting, accepting, unaware. And now that I had noticed, now that I had begun to see the pattern forming beneath the surface, there was only one thing left to do. I needed to know how far it went and, more importantly, how long they had believed they could keep it hidden. The next few days moved with a kind of quiet precision that I had not felt in years, each step deliberate, each decision measured, as if I were learning how to move through my own life again, but with a clearer understanding of where I was placing my trust, and where I was no longer willing to place it. The records I requested arrived sooner than expected, a thick envelope delivered by certified mail, the weight of it noticeable in my hands before I even opened it, as if the paper itself carried more than just information, as if it held the shape of something that had been building for longer than I had realized. I sat at my desk, the same desk where Thomas and I had once balanced budgets together, where we had made decisions side by side, and I opened the envelope carefully, not rushing, not hesitating, just allowing the process to unfold exactly as it needed to. Page after page, document after document, I laid everything out in front of me, creating a timeline not from memory, but from facts, from recorded actions that did not rely on what I thought had happened but on what had been officially documented. At first, the pattern was subtle, almost easy to overlook if you were not paying attention. A change in mailing address here, a redirected notice there, small adjustments that could easily be explained as administrative updates, the kind of thing someone might handle on your behalf if they believed they were helping. But as I continued, as I moved further back through the records, the pattern became clearer, more defined, no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence. The lake property transfer had not been the first change. It had been one of many. Accounts had been consolidated, names had been added and removed, permissions had shifted quietly from one person to another, all under my name, all carrying signatures that looked enough like mine to pass without question, but not enough to be truly mine. I paused, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the desk, and allowed myself to absorb what I was seeing without reacting too quickly, because this was no longer about a single moment of confusion or a single document that did not make sense. This was a sequence, a process that had been unfolding over time, each step small enough to go unnoticed, each change positioned in a way that relied on my assumption that everything was as it should be. I reached for one document in particular, an authorization form dated just 3 months after Thomas passed, granting limited access to certain accounts for assistance with financial management, and I remembered that time clearly now, the way everything had felt overwhelming, the way Emily had sat beside me, her voice calm, explaining that this would simply allow her to help organize things, to make sure nothing was missed while I adjusted to handling everything on my own. I had signed that form without hesitation, grateful for the support, trusting that it would be used exactly as described. But now, looking at the sequence of records that followed, I could see how that single decision had opened a door that had never truly been closed. Again, access had expanded, authority had shifted, and with each step my involvement had become smaller, more passive, until I was no longer making decisions at all, only assuming they were being made in my best interest. I leaned back slowly in my chair, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because the truth, once it begins to reveal itself, does not need to be forced into place. Fits on its own. The question was no longer whether something had been done. That was clear now. The question was how much had been done, and how intentionally it had been carried out. I gathered several of the most recent documents and placed them side by side, comparing dates, signatures, authorization levels, and what I saw confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not carelessness. This was not confusion. This was control, established gradually, maintained quietly, and justified along the way as assistance, as support, as something done for me rather than to me. I stood and walked to the window again, the same place I had stood just days before, but everything felt different now, not heavier, not more overwhelming, but clearer, as if the uncertainty had been replaced by something more solid, something that did not shift depending on how I felt about it. I did not feel anger rising in me. Not the kind that demands immediate action or confrontation. What I felt was steadiness, a kind of calm that comes when doubt is removed and replaced with understanding. I turned back toward the desk and gathered the documents into a folder, labeling it carefully, not with emotion but with purpose, because this was no longer about what I suspected or what I feared. This was about what I could prove. And proof, unlike suspicion, does not rely on belief. It stands on its own. I reached for my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had been looking for, a name I had not needed to call in years, someone Thomas had once trusted when it came to matters like this, someone who understood not just documents and signatures, but the weight of what they represented. I hesitated for only a moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, because I knew that once I made this call, I would no longer be observing from a distance. I would be stepping into something that required action, clarity, and a willingness to see things exactly as they were, without softening the edges. Then I pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear, and as it began to ring, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they chose to tell me, but by what I had already begun to uncover on my own. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, steady, and familiar in a way that brought back a different time, a time when decisions were made with clarity and nothing needed to be second-guessed. And when he said my name, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just recognition. "Margaret, it has been a long time," he said, and I could almost picture him sitting at his desk, the same way Thomas used to describe, organized, precise, the kind of man who paid attention to details others might overlook. "It has," I replied, my tone just as even, because this was not a call made out of panic, but out of purpose, and purpose requires a certain steadiness. I explained what I had found, not everything at once, but enough for him to understand the situation without overwhelming the facts. And he listened without interrupting, without offering immediate conclusions, which told me more than any quick reaction could have. When I finished, there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, but measured, as if he were placing each piece of information exactly where it belonged before speaking. "Bring everything you have," he said finally, his voice lower now, more focused, "and do not discuss this with anyone else until we have reviewed it together." I agreed without hesitation, because I understood what he was saying beneath the words, that once something like this is acknowledged, it cannot be handled casually, and more importantly, it should not be revealed before you are ready to stand on what you know. The following morning I drove to his office, a modest building just outside the downtown area. The kind of place that does not draw attention but holds years of quiet expertise within its walls. As I walked in, I felt that same sense of calm I had felt the day before, not because the situation was simple, but because I was no longer navigating it alone. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his expression thoughtful as he gestured for me to sit, and I placed the folder on his desk with care, sliding it toward him as if I were handing over something that needed to be examined with precision, not emotion. He opened it slowly, reviewing each document in silence, his eyes moving steadily across the pages, occasionally pausing, occasionally turning back to compare one with another, and I watched without speaking, allowing him the space to see what I had already begun to understand. Time passed differently in that room, measured not by minutes but by the movement of paper, the shifting of attention from one detail to the next, until finally he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together as he looked at me in a way that was direct but not unkind. "You were right to come in," he said, and there was no comfort in the words, only confirmation, the kind that settles something permanently. This was not an administrative error. I nodded once, because I had already reached that conclusion myself, but hearing it stated so clearly removed any remaining doubt. "These changes," he continued, tapping lightly on the documents, "were made over time, and they were made by someone who understood exactly how to structure them so they would not raise immediate concern." I felt no need to ask who, not yet, because the answer in many ways had already been forming on its own. "The signatures," he added, turning one of the pages toward me, "are close enough to pass initial review, but under closer examination they show inconsistencies. That suggests they were replicated, not authorized in the way they appear." I let my gaze rest on the paper, not because I needed to see it again, but because I wanted to hear every word without interruption. "And the access permissions," he continued, "once granted, allowed for additional changes without requiring further direct approval from you, which means whoever was managing these accounts had the ability to expand their control. Incrementally. Control. The word settled in quietly, not as a surprise, but as a final piece clicking into place. What does that mean for me? I asked, my voice steady, not seeking reassurance but clarity. He did not answer immediately, which told me that his response would not be simple. It means, he said finally, that we need to establish exactly what was transferred, when it was transferred, and under what authority, and then determine the appropriate steps to correct it. I nodded again, absorbing the process rather than reacting to the implications, because correction requires understanding before anything else. And it also means, he added, his tone sharpening slightly, that you should not alert the individuals involved until we have a complete picture, because once they know you are aware, their behavior may change. I understood that without needing further explanation. People protect what they believe they can still control. Can this be reversed? I asked, not out of hope but out of practicality, because the answer would shape what came next. He considered that for a moment before responding. Some of it, yes, he said carefully, but the approach will depend on how these transfers were executed and whether they were acted upon by third parties in good faith. I let that settle, not allowing it to overwhelm me, because this was not a moment for conclusions, only for preparation. When I left his office, the folder felt different in my hands, not heavier but more defined, as if it now carried not just questions but direction, and as I walked to my car, I realized that whatever had been done with the expectation that I would remain unaware, that I would continue trusting, continue accepting, continue believing that everything was as it should be. And now, for the first time, I was not just aware. I was ready. The following week unfolded with a quiet discipline that I had not needed to exercise in years, each day structured not by habit, but by intention, and I found myself moving through familiar spaces with a different awareness, noticing not just what was there, but what had been overlooked for far too long. I met with him again. 2 days later, bringing additional records he had requested, and this time the conversation was more direct, less about discovery and more about confirmation, because by then, the pattern had already been established. There is enough here to move forward, he said, closing the folder with a measured motion, but we need to proceed carefully, step by step. I nodded, understanding that precision would matter more than speed, and he outlined what needed to be done next: requests to freeze certain changes, formal inquiries to institutions that had processed the transfers, and most importantly, documentation prepared in a way that would stand without question if it were ever challenged. I listened, not overwhelmed but focused, because each step gave shape to something that had once felt uncertain. And as I left his office, I realized that what I was doing now was not simply reacting to what had been done, but reclaiming the space that had been quietly taken from me. At home, I continued as I always had, maintaining the same routines, answering the same calls, responding to messages with the same calm tone I had always used, because there is a certain advantage in being underestimated, in allowing others to believe that nothing has changed when everything has. Daniel called midweek, his voice casual, asking if I needed anything, if I was doing all right, and I answered him the same way I always had, reassuring, steady, giving him nothing that would suggest otherwise, because I understood now that awareness is most powerful when it remains unseen. Everything is fine, I told him, and in that moment, the words carried a different meaning, one that he could not hear but that I understood completely. Later that evening, Emily sent a message, a brief one, checking in, mentioning that she had been reviewing some old paperwork and asking if I needed help organizing anything further, and I read it carefully, noting the wording, the timing, the subtle reach towards something she believed she still controlled. I replied simply, thanking her, saying I had everything under control, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to imagine how that message would be received, how it might be interpreted, and I wondered if she would recognize the shift, or if she would continue to believe that I remained exactly as I had always been. The next step requires something more deliberate, something that would bring everything into a single space where it could no longer be separated into small, manageable pieces, and I knew it needed to be done in a way that appeared natural, expected, something they would not question before it was too late to adjust. So I called Daniel on Thursday afternoon and suggested dinner on Sunday. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, just a simple invitation, the kind that had been extended countless times before, and he agreed without hesitation, his tone easy, unaware of anything beyond what he expected the evening to be. Emily confirmed shortly after, her message polite, appreciative, and I set the phone down with a quiet sense of clarity, because the moment had begun to take shape, not as confrontation but as resolution. Over the next 2 days I prepared not just the meal, but everything that would come with it, reviewing the documents one final time, organizing them in a way that made the sequence undeniable, each page leading to the next without confusion, without gaps, because clarity leaves no room for explanation. I placed them in a folder and set it aside, not hidden, not displayed, simply waiting, because timing, I had learned, is what gives truth its weight. Sunday arrived again, just as quietly as the last, but this time, there was no uncertainty in how the day would unfold, only a steady awareness of what would follow. I set the table as I always did, each detail in place, each movement measured, because the setting did not need to change for the truth to be seen, and when I heard the sound of their car pulling into the driveway, I stood at the door, my hand resting lightly on the handle, not with hesitation but with certainty. I opened it before they knocked, offering the same calm expression, the same quiet welcome, and as they stepped inside, I saw them as I had always seen them, and also as I now understood them to be, two people who had believed they were moving unnoticed, who had believed that careful steps would remain unseen, and for the first time, I knew exactly how far that belief would carry them before it reached its end. The evening unfolded with the same quiet rhythm as every Sunday before it, the soft clink of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the careful balance of familiarity and distance that had come to define our time together, and I moved through it all with a calm that no longer came from habit, but from certainty. Daniel spoke about work again, something about a new project, deadlines that stretched into late nights, and I listened the way I always had, nodding at the right moments, offering small responses that kept the conversation flowing without drawing attention, while Emily added her usual comments, precise, measured, filling in the gaps as if she had already anticipated what needed to be said before it was spoken. But tonight, I was not listening to their words. I was listening to what remained unsaid, to the ease with which they moved through a version of reality they believed was still intact. When dinner ended, I did not clear the table right away. Instead, I folded my hands lightly in front of me and let the silence settle, not heavy, not abrupt, but deliberate, the kind of pause that invites attention without demanding it. Daniel noticed first, his expression shifting slightly as he looked at me, as if sensing that something had changed even if he could not yet name it. Emily followed a moment later, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly, her awareness sharpening in a way that told me she understood the difference between routine and intention. I went back to the county office this week, I said, my voice even, the same tone I had used before, but this time there was no attempt to soften the words or place them casually into conversation. They were simply there, clear and direct, and I watched as the space between them shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough. Daniel glanced at Emily for just a second, a movement so quick it might have gone unnoticed before, but not now, not anymore. "Oh," he said, his voice careful, as if stepping into something he had not fully prepared for, and Emily's expression remained composed, but there was a stillness in her that had not been there before, a pause that did not quite belong to the moment. I reached for the folder beside me, the one I had prepared with such care, and placed it gently on the table between us, not with force, not as an accusation, but as a simple act of acknowledgement. I also spoke with someone who reviewed these records, I continued, opening the folder and turning it so they could see the pages inside, each one arranged in a sequence that required no explanation. I did not rush. I did not point. I simply allowed the evidence to exist in front of them, because truth, when presented clearly, does not need to be argued. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the documents with a growing tension he could not fully hide, while Emily remained still for a moment longer before reaching out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper with a control that seemed almost practiced. "There seems to be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm, controlled, but this time, the words did not carry the same ease they once had, because the space for explanation had already been narrowed. I looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that did not need to be defended. "There is no misunderstanding," I said quietly, and the words settled with a weight that did not come from volume, but from certainty. I turned one of the pages slightly, aligning it with another, allowing the differences in the signatures to sit side by side, undeniable in their precision. "These were not signed by me," I added, my tone unchanged, as if stating something as simple as the date or the time, and for the first time Emily did not respond immediately. Daniel's gaze moved between us, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to realization, as if the pieces he had avoided assembling were finally being placed in front of him in a way he could not ignore. "Mom, he began, but the words did not fully form, because whatever he was about to say no longer fit the reality unfolding in front of him. I did not interrupt him, but I did not need to hear the rest either. Instead, I placed one final document on top of the stack, the authorization form, the one that had started it all, and I let my hand rest lightly on it for a moment before speaking again. I trusted you, I said, not loudly, not emotionally, just plainly, because the truth of that statement did not require emphasis. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It carried recognition, consequence, something that could not be undone simply by offering an explanation. Emily finally spoke, her voice softer now, less certain, as if adjusting to a situation she had not anticipated. We were only trying to help, she said, and I held her gaze for a moment, not to challenge her, but to let the words exist exactly as they were. Help does not require secrecy, I replied, my voice steady, unchanged, and in that moment something shifted completely, not in the room, not in the space around us, but in the understanding of what had been done and what could no longer be hidden. I closed the folder slowly, gathering the documents back into a single stack, not because I needed to protect them, but because I had already shown everything that needed to be seen. Then I looked at them both, not as I had before, not with assumption or expectation, but with clarity, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to fill the silence or soften the truth, because what had been taken was no longer invisible, and what came next would no longer depend on what they chose to say, but on what had already been proven.